All right, guys, welcome back to video number 3 in the options education module. This video is going to be a little bit more jam-packed like video number 1, so get ready to take notes. This is a pretty important video. So we've talked about buying options, right? The fundamentals of buying, okay? Both calls and puts. We're going to now talk about selling options, right? Because the risk to reward profile is opposite. We already talked about exercising, but we'll go over it again because it's important for sellers. And again, expiration matters when selling. So we're going to look at that. Selling and buying. Liquidity and why liquidity matters. So let's jump into the module. So we're going to look at SPY, which is what we've been doing. And also, guys, you can also see that I have calls, puts, selling, and buying, right? So we're going to literally dive into why someone would do each, right? Because now we're going to look at both sides of the trade. So if I'm pulling up SPY, again, share price of 663 that we've been looking at to keep it even, and our entire option chain with different days till expiration, right? So let's go on to a 42 day till expiration, right? So if we pop down here, we're looking at calls, out of the money, in the money, right? Now, if I flip on sell, it's going to be the exact same price, right? All we're doing is it's the different rights of the contract, right? So instead, we're selling a call or writing a call, right? So when you kind of sell that call, you're creating a contract to sell, right? Buying, you're paying this, okay? When you buy a contract, you're paying the price for the right of it, right? When you're selling a contract, someone is paying you, okay? So right here, key difference. When buying a call, you're paying a debit. When selling a call, you are receiving the credit, okay? Now, we talked about buying calls and the fact that it gives the call option holder, right, the buyer of the call, the right, not the obligation, to purchase shares at the strike price, right? And it makes sense to exercise that, right, when the share price is above the strike price. So the strike is in the money, right? Well, how are call buyers actually able to buy the shares at that price, right? Great question. That comes down to the other side of the trade. Someone's selling the call, right? So when you sell options, you need collateral for the buyers, right? In case the buyers exercise their right, right? So when I'm selling calls, what do I need for collateral, right? I'll kind of let you think. So if a call buyer is allowed to purchase shares at that price, what does the sell caller or the person who's selling calls, need to provide? So the answer is shares. They need to provide shares because if you're buying calls at say the 660, right? You bought the 660 call. This gives you the right to purchase shares at this price, right? Those shares don't just come out of nowhere, right? Someone needs to give them the shares, right? So this is where the seller needs to provide that collateral, right? So when you sell a call, you always need 100 shares of collateral, right? Because if you sold a call that was 660, right? It is in the money. The contract holder, the buyer, is probably going to exercise their right to buy shares at that price, right? So thus you need to sell your shares at 660, okay? That's why you need shares in order to sell the call, okay? Now, the only time where you will not need to sell your shares is if the strike price is out of the money at expiration, right? So say you sold a 670 call, right? The call buyer isn't going to want to exercise their right because they can buy shares at this price over this price. So then you don't need to move your shares anywhere. You simply pocket the premium you paid that they paid for the option, right? And you get to keep your shares, right? It was just collateral if, for whatever reason, the contract goes in the money. Now let's talk about puts. Puts, as a buyer, right? So again, in the money, out of the money, okay? When buying a put, it gives you the right, not the obligation, to sell shares at the strike, right? So it makes sense. These are in the money. It makes sense to sell your shares at a higher price than market share, right? The market price. So selling shares, okay? Receiving something for selling shares, right? So when I'm selling a put, what form of collateral do I need to provide? What you think? So again, buying a put, as the put holder, I'm allowed to sell shares at this price, right? So what does the sell put, the person who's selling the put, need to provide in collateral? And the answer is cash. They need to provide cash collateral, right? Because if they, as the put buyer, if they want to sell their shares at this, you need to be able to provide the equivalent cash to give them, right? And then you buy the shares, right? You're essentially buying shares at this price and they are getting the capital for it, right? So just to break that down, if I sold a put, right, for $665, this is in the money, right? So at expiration, let's say I have the $665 put and the share price is lower. The put holder, the buyer of the put who holds the contract rights, is going to exercise their right to sell the shares at a higher price, right? That makes sense because they would rather sell at $665 over $663.5. So as the put seller, that means that I needed the collateral of cash, right, to be able to put on this, this option, and thus I would need to buy shares at this price, right? So I'm buying 100 shares at $665, and the put buyer then can sell the shares at that price, right? So that's called exercising, right? You got exercised on the contract. You were forced to buy shares at this price. Now, again, if the contract was out of the money, you simply, again, pocket the premium you were paid as the put seller, and you get to walk away with the cash, right? Because you don't have to buy shares if the contract is out of the money, right? So let's recap with selling again, right? Selling, you get premium for the contract, right? Because you're selling it to someone. They pay for the contract. So you get premium, okay? If a call is out of the money, you do not need to sell your shares because calls, you need shares as collateral, right? If it's out of the money at expiration, you do not need to sell your shares. If it's in the money at expiration, you will need to sell your shares at that strike price, okay? And whatever gain or loss you make is incurred, right? So say I bought shares originally of SPY at $600, and now I sold a contract for $660, right? I pocketed the premium as the call seller, and I make the difference of $660 and $600. So you can actually get a capital gains because remember, all it's saying is you're selling stock at that price, right? That's all it's saying. So you sold stock for either a gain or loss, and you pocketed the premium if the call is in the money. With puts, if they're out of the money, you don't need to do anything. You simply collect your cash, and I mean out of the money here, that's in the money. So out of the money here, you don't need to buy any sort of stock, right? You pocket the premium. If it's in the money, you have to buy the stock, and you get the premium regardless, right? So for instance, let's say that you put the trade on to sell a put when SPY was, I don't know, at $680 a share, right? Hypothetically. And you sold the $670, you would get the premium, and you would actually be getting the shares on a discount from when they were when you put the trade on, right? So it's almost like a paid limit order, right? You got these shares at this, and you made the premium. Premium comes in regardless, guys. Now let's talk about liquidity, right? So when does it not make sense to sell or buy a contract? It makes sense to buy a contract when obviously you have the directional bias or whatever bias you would like. So for instance, if you're a put buyer, you have a downwards bias, call buyer, upwards bias. But if you also take a look here, we can see, and we're going to get into the Greeks and all this fancy stuff, right? But we're just going to look at the bid and the ask, right? SPY options are extremely liquid and the spread is tighter, right? So by spread, I mean bid is a buyer and ask is a seller, right? Think about, like, in simple terms, if you go to the grocery store, right? And they're selling eggs at $7 a dozen, right? Pretty expensive eggs or whatnot, right? You have the bidders, who are the buyers, right? The customers, and the ask is simply the grocery store, right? So if the ask was so far away from the bid, no one would buy, right? Say the eggs were $12, right? They're gonna get no buyers because they're like, hell no, I'm gonna go somewhere else. I don't want your eggs, right? So the bid and ask is important to be together. That's when trades happen, right? And these are within 4 cents of one another, right? So those are very tight bid and asks, right? Now, if I go to something like something illiquid, so let's go to maybe let's check out Occidental Petroleum. Okay, and let's go farther out, just to pick a contract, right? And let's go to sell put, right? And let's pick something like here, which actually is not too bad. But just for the sake of the video, you can see that the bid ask is a little bit wider, being 6 cents away instead of SPY's 3 cents away. Now, again, for sake of the video, this is actually not a bad spread, but sometimes, actually, I do have a good example. For instance, Lululemon. If I were to be buying a call, because I've seen this expiration before, buy this call, say I'm buying the 185, you can see that, yes, the bid ask is almost a full dollar away, right? So you're not going to really want to get tied up in buying and selling these options because you're losing the spread between them, right? Because in order to, open the trade, right? If you're a buyer, you need to go to the ask, right? So like, for instance, to go back to the supermarket explanation, if you want to buy those like $12 eggs, like you really need to buy the $12 eggs and you don't want to just be sitting around waiting for them to come back to $8, you're going to need to pay $12, right? So if I wanted to enter this call, if I bought the call, I need to go to the ask. And if I wanted to sell the call that I bought, I would need to go to the bid, right? So I lose on the spread, right? And that spread is significant, right? That is a dollar difference, right? So that's when it maybe wouldn't make sense to be buying and trading those options. So again, that's called slippage between the bid and ask. You're going to want to look for tighter spreads, right? And tighter, I meant, within a few cents, within a couple of tens of cents, right? So Lululemon is a little bit illiquid. However, something like, again, let's pull up like something like SoFi. SoFi is going to be a little bit more liquid, right? So if I come up to here, go a little bit out, you can see if I choose this one, again, they're within 5 cents, right? A little bit more liquid. These are perfectly nice and liquid, right? So you're gonna be losing less on the spread. Hopefully that all makes sense. And congratulations, we are on to module 2. So you have the foundations. Be sure to watch back the videos. Type in the chat if you have any questions in the Discord for any clarification, and I'll be sure to answer that. But let's move on to module 2 in the next video. We will see you there.